Hi, it's Reverend Dr. Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan, and I'm reading to you tonight from my new book, just published. And this is actually, I'm reading from a proof copy, so there's a weird bar on the cover, but it is called Passing the Baton, Birth Control, Precondition of the Liberation of Women. And so I want to read to you a short section and one of the stories in the book. And the short introductory section I'm going to read. I begin with a quote from Margaret Sanger that is from the death. She wrote it on the death of a New York City woman who begged for the secret of preventing pregnancy. So this woman had died. Okay, so it's called Reproductive Self-Determination. A lot of her work was with new immigrants crowded into the ghettos, the slums of the urban cities in the Northeast. So reproductive self-determination. I looked out my window and down upon the dimly lighted city. Its pains and griefs crowded in upon me. Women writhing in travail to bring forth little babies. The babies themselves, naked and hungry, wrapped in newspapers to keep them from the cold. 6-year-old children with pinched, pale, wrinkled faces, old in concentrated wretchedness, pushed into gray and fetid cellars, crouching on stone floors. White coffins, black coffins, coffins interminably passing in never-ending succession, piled one upon another on another, the destiny of mothers whose miseries were vast as the sky. The footnote on that page says, according to her grandson, Alex Sanger, that his great-grandmother, her mother, was pregnant 18 times, had 11 children and 7 miscarriages, and was dead at the age of 49. This is not an uncommon story, he said, in 19th century America. And his grandmother, Sanger, became an obstetrical nurse on the Lower East Side of New York, where birth control was simply not available for the poor immigrant women there. And she saw one too many go back to the back alley for an abortion or self-abort with a knitting needle or shoe hook or undiluted Lysol, and woman after woman literally died in my grandmother's arms. And she said, enough, there's got to be something better we can do. Autonomy and safety. Oh no, I want to read how it used to be on page 1. In an upscale Italian restaurant local to me, on the wall above the heads of customers hung an antique blown up family photo. Central in the photo is a couple seated, presumably also Italian, like the restaurant. Behind them stand one set of older parents and an assortment of adults. Given the rules of patriarchal arranged marriage, these adults may be presumed to be the paternal parents and the siblings of the male of the seated couple. On the floor at the feet of the couple sit 9 stair-step children. The face of the seated male in the central couple beams with pride at his offspring, but in the woman's face, the light has gone out. In fact, in each of the women's faces, standing around her, her mother and sisters-in-law, there is no smile in any of their eyes or on any of their lips. To the left of that photo hangs another, a shot of great architecture. In it, stone cathedral spires stretch toward the skies. Able-bodied, muscled males labor around its base. 2 of the workmen pause to beam up admiringly at their own handiwork. In this photo, there are no work women. Page 2, autonomy and safety. Without some form of female-controlled birth contraception, the one who gets pregnant has to be able to control whether or not that happens, right? Without some form of female-controlled contraception, without pregnancy prevention in the hands of the partner who may be impregnated, a woman's anatomy may indeed be her destiny. If she marries or partners heterosexually, the number of children she bears and the impact on her life and health is the crapshoot of her own and her partner's degree of fertility. Without access to and consistent use of female-controlled contraception, girls and women here and around the world are at markedly greater risk of having their life trajectories and personal autonomy hijacked by unwanted and unplanned pregnancies. In the long era before the creation of reliable birth control, and in areas with limited access to contraception today, few women, no matter their other demographics, entered higher education or had the opportunity to craft careers of their own choice. Instead, marriage was, and there is, generally the only way to keep herself and to keep oneself and one's children from starving. Historically, few women have had the opportunity or the desire to choose celibacy as a means of contraception. Instead, most women were or are forced by family and circumstance to marry. And married women were and are expected to service their men, to have penile vaginal intercourse, whether or not such sex pleased them, and whether or not they wanted to conceive more children. As I ate my rigatoni and worked on this text, the face of that mother of 9 kept cutting into my consciousness, bringing back another mother's unsmiling face in another photo, one in which I stood, also not smiling, one of 12 stair-step children. 7 of us standing around our seated parents' shoulders, 4 of us sitting on the floor at their feet, one so young he was still on our mother's lap, father's face beaming. 8 of us were born before the advent of the birth control pill. 10 of us were born before the Supreme Court ruled that pill legal to be prescribed to married women. All of us were born to a woman whose church forbid her the use of any artificial means of birth control, which church continues to do so to this day, even under the present Pope. The only contraceptive choice they gave her was to not make love with the man she loved 2/3 of each month, just before, during, and after ovulation, and during her period, if he were kind enough to take her no for an answer. As I knew him, my father was kind, not at all an abuser. And as I knew her, I presumed my mother didn't actually want to say no to her much-loved, well-suited husband. The Right to Life movement calls natural family planning, also known as the rhythm method, because it involves repeated, rhythmically abstaining from sex during a woman's fertile period. They call it sufficient to plan and space children. So does the current Pope, Francis, who has not reversed the ex cathedra ruling of Pope Paul VI in his 1968 encyclical letter, Humanae Vitae. To quote my registered nurse mother, wife of my family physician, doctor of osteopathy father, in regard to the rhythm method, my mother said, all 13 of you were rhythm babies. In my mother's face, so I had a twin who passed, so she gave birth to 13 children in 12 pregnancies. 12 children survived. In my mother's face, in the faces of the women in the photo at the Italian, and she did it in 14.5 years. In my mother's face, in the faces of the women in the photo at the Italian restaurant, heavy with the burden of their own reproduction, heavy with the burden of bearing and tending child after child, single-handedly while their men worked, is the answer to the mystery of women's historic invisibility, the answer to why there are no work women in the photo of the ascending cathedral. For the heterosexual or heterosexually married woman or female victim of rape who cannot plan, space, or choose not to bear children, there is no designing or executing architecture, no art or literature, no place in history. The realities of compulsory marriage and heterosexual reproduction without means for its control account for a great deal of the historic disparity of power and accomplishment between women and men. It is access to reliable female-controlled contraception that has changed the status of women in the developed world from childbearing drudges to self-sustainable economic units, opening the doors of education and the professions of business and ministry, of law and medicine to women on a trajectory aiming toward parity with men. Contraception, the right to and access to female-controlled contraception, is a precondition of the liberation of women and, by extension, of their men. Without the ability to prevent pregnancy, no woman or adolescent girl can be free of domination. Whenever and wherever contraceptive information and consistent access to reliable methods of birth control are not available, girls and women are not able to plan and follow their own life courses. In the developing world today, wherever contraceptive information and access are limited, women are not free. When pregnancy cannot be planned or prevented or early undone, a girl's or woman's life can be taken completely off course by a single act of voluntary or involuntary sexual intercourse. The girl or woman who wants to be someone, who wants to accomplish or make a contribution, who has a passion for a field of inquiry or for a means of self-expression, can be swept out of competition. Pregnant, or as the mother of young children, it becomes much more difficult, even impossible, to finish school, to obtain a higher education, to have the time necessary to practice a craft or the concentration necessary to found a business. The mother of young children can be stopped simply by that circumstance from further academic and career pursuits, and even with determination, may simply be unable to get back to them for a decade and more, thus consigning her to financial dependency on a husband or male relatives, and perhaps thereby even to abuse. Through pregnancy, while not always dominated, because not all men are abusers, even a first world woman can be made subject to the rule of men. She can be pressured by partner, family, or the social order to marry a man she would not have chosen. Chosen or not, married or not, through childbearing, she can be trapped by a man looking to control her, because he, like all fathers, has parental rights. And through her love for her children, she can be bound to an abuser for life. Through the mechanisms of motherhood, her heart can be broken time and again if an abuser uses her children against her, either by alienating their affection from her or by harming the children directly in ways she cannot physically or legally stop. And I will prove much of that through this book. Enacted in secret behind closed doors, physical and or sexual abuse by partners and fathers often cannot be sufficiently proven in court. And even when concrete evidence exists, medical examinations, reports by teachers and counselors, records of police calls for domestic or sexual violence, it still may not be proven in court, especially if the victim or victim's mother, deprived of a full education and lucrative career through early and or repeated pregnancy, finds herself without sufficient money for the extensive legal fees necessary to find and hire a good lawyer to successfully take the perpetrator to court. Without contraception, in social orders where women en masse have little to no access to birth control information or female-controlled contraception, women can be and are en masse denied access to higher education and self-determined careers. They may work, selling their time for money, cooking and cleaning and taking in laundry and taking care of the children of the higher socioeconomic classes, but undereducated women are in general shut out of the professions and careers wherein one may earn a self-supporting living wage. In our own US history just 4 and 5 decades ago, women as a class, no matter their race or socioeconomic status, as soon as they got pregnant or preemptively as soon as they got married, because it was assumed they would shortly get pregnant, and that repeatedly, were routinely fired from jobs that put them in contact with the public. It was unseemly for a woman in a family way to be on such public display, and employers didn't want to hire, train, or retain a category of worker who was likely to get pregnant 4, 6, 10, or even 14 times across the next 2 decades. Thus, married female employees and female employees of reproductive age were a bad bet for business. Even when single, women as a class were denied access to entire fields because it was presumed most female employees would marry and turn up pregnant at some time. The newspaper want ads and the job market itself were segregated by sex. As a means of further limiting their access, women as a class needed higher scores on college and graduate school entrance exams to be admitted to higher or postgraduate education. Universities, colleges, vocational training schools, and employers in general had an excuse not to admit or hire females because they occupied a sex caste that it was presumed would terminate their studies or employment early due to intended or unintended pregnancy, thus effectively blocking most women's participation in professional and semi-professional careers. The various waves of women's organized collective action have played an enormous role in making change, but as part and parcel of the movements for women's liberation, the impact of first world women's access to reliable, female-controlled contraception on their path to actual equality cannot be overestimated. And now I will conclude with a narrative. It's just a couple of pages long, and it begins on page 10, and it's entitled Motherless Despair. This is set back in the 1950s era, about motherless despair. So this is when women did not have access, before the birth control pill had been invented, before there were reliable hormonal methods of birth control, and when it was relatively difficult, even especially for married women, to get other barrier methods. Motherless despair. With deep despair, she heard the verdict she already knew. Year by year, again and again, her doctor gave her the same sentence: pregnant. But this was the 17th time, and they were simply stretched to their limit. Her husband couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Sex was what she was for. Sex and childbearing. He wanted sex day after day, no matter what condition she was in. He was interested when she was postpartum. He was interested when she was big as a house. No matter the girth of her belly, he found a way to relieve himself on her, in her, night after night. The only things that slowed him down were the mini epidemics, like the time the mumps swept through the house and 10 of the 12 children born at the time fell ill. And even though his salary didn't fit the bills, he still made time to get his beer at the local pub and come home feeling ornery, enough to tell her to lie down or to swat her a good one if she objected. So the doctor had collected her urine and the rabbit had died, and her drunken husband would sit in the waiting room again while she panted and moaned another underfed mouth into their world. She already cooked on a whim and a prayer. A morning meal for her brood was 3-day-old donuts her sister slipped out of the storefront bakery, where she was paid a minimum wage of 75 cents per hour, and the bakery's leftover coffee, given even to the toddlers and only sometimes with a splash of milk. And lunch was peanut butter, with the tiniest smear of jelly, and 3-day-old bread, again pinched from the same bakery's refuse pile. And dinner was a solitary pound of ground meat mixed with flour and water, then used to wet the pile of mashed potatoes that made up the bulk of the meal. Her children called it hishy hash, and that had to stretch to feed the 18 already in the world mouths around the table, father, mother, and 16 kids. How could they become 19? And when would this end? She was already 38. But her mother didn't hit the menopause until 48. She couldn't bear children another decade, and her husband wouldn't stop. Maybe her father had stopped. Her mother only had the 12. Maybe her father had stopped. But of one thing she was sure: she couldn't stretch her drinking husband's factory wages by one more plate. She already didn't know what she would say to the landlord next week or how she would keep the lights on. She already made tallow candles whenever there was enough rendered meat fat to make them with, and kept the lights off each night to keep down the electric bill. And they couldn't afford a clothes dryer or a decent washer. Her old wringer washer would have to do, and her daughters would have to keep hanging the clothes on the line and bringing them in before a thunderstorm to fold them damp and stiff and dingy from their exposure to city air. They didn't have a vacuum, only a broom. But he had his nightly beer and his nightly inebriated 2-minute shot at her. Thank God he's quick, she thought. But even that thought gave her no joy. She had to get back to relieve her mother, who was sitting the youngest 5. She had slipped to the doctor's while the older ones were at school. Soon the 2 oldest girls would be looking to them to help with their weddings. There was no way they could even try to give them away. She shook her head to bring herself back to the present. I must think about the matter at hand, she worried, bringing herself up short. Once, across the backyard fence when the girls were in school and the storm was whipping up, she had gone to bring the washing in herself and stopped to discuss the weather with Mrs. Pritz on the other side. Mrs. Pritz had lowered her voice and whispered about Mrs. McLaughlin down the block. She noted that her stomach had started to grow last year and then shrunk again, too soon. Somewhere in the gossip, she dropped a name, a Dr. McInerney on the other side of the park, who might have helped Mrs. McLaughlin out. She walked home, but despite her waiting mother, went the long way round, cresting the park's far side to pass his shingle. Could she do it? Would she burn in hell? Hell, she argued internally, hell. This is already hell. She was staving off hunger with potatoes and donuts. She was dodging bill collectors and robbing Peter for Paul. She was already wearing the shame of not being able to help her daughters marry. She was increasingly worried that her next child or the one after that might be medically harmed, even retarded because she was too old to be having it. She was the sexual servant of a drunken fool who didn't care what happened to his own children, who kept on making more against her will when he couldn't support the ones he already had. A week later, she went to Dr. McInerney. He was horrified at the suggestion he might be able to help her in her predicament. He commanded her to leave and slammed his treatment room door closed behind her. Confused, as she struggled with her coat, his nurse glanced round, pulled her into the receptionist space, and pressed a note into her hand. On it was scrawled a number, CH50746. With a knowing look, the nurse helped her fix her coat and nudged her toward the exit. Her fingers shook as she lifted the kitchen receiver and spun the dial. On the other end, a husky voice asked curt questions. Yes, he could help. He named his price and gave her a date 3 weeks away. A date and a location and a price she didn't have. Except for the funds she'd been spiriting away from every transaction and had refused to spend. Each time she bought or paid for anything, she took the change, not the bills, and when no one was looking, dropped it into an empty oatmeal carton in the back of a closet. When that got full, she hid it behind a stack of boxes in an unvisited corner of the attic. The change was there for a rainy day. She was saving it for the day when he retired, or the day when he was struck by a trolley as he stumbled home drunk, or the day when they laid him off for time out of work for hangovers, or for the money to simply bury him. Or maybe she would let him go to a potter's field and use it to feed his children a little while longer before they all joined him on the other side from malnutrition or starvation when his drunken self left them even more destitute. She began to feed the coins into paper sleeves, rolls of quarters and dimes and nickels, even the pennies. She rolled and rolled until she had the abortionist's price. She could not see her way clear to take all of that change to the bank and turn it into bills. That would raise suspicion, raise the notice of the gossips, maybe even find its way to her husband's ear. He might beat her for sure if he found she had hidden money and change. And what was it for anyway, he would demand as his blows rained down. The image shook her. Usually she acquiesced so quickly to his demands that her children rarely saw his rage. Actually, they rarely saw him at all, with his second shift factory hours and his liquid after-work dinners. She showed up at the designated location with a tote bag filled with rolled coin. A squeaky wooden door swung open on the hand of a man half-shadowed in the vestibule. There was no receptionist. It was a mere apartment. The yellowed peony wallpaper was missing strips, and the front room looked cluttered. A wooden console television rang out with the sound of a bugle playing charge as the U.S. cavalry streamed across the screen, flag waving, riding down an encampment of unarmed Indian women and children. The kitchen table was laid with an absorbent cloth, and a metal cart stood next to it, steel tools gleaming on its top shelf. Taking the money gruffly, he eyed the rolls and counted before pointing toward the table and grunting, gesturing that she should remove her underpants and climb aboard. He handed her a questionably clean towel, indicating that she should bite on it if she felt like screaming. Without washing his hands and without any sort of pain relief or anesthesia, he inserted a cold speculum and began to dig at her cervix. She bit the towel, reminding herself that she did this for her living children, promising herself she would find the way never to sleep with her husband again. This was a price she intended to pay only once. She felt him scraping around inside her, then she felt something sharper, something like a slip and a pierce, and she groaned into her towel. When it was over, she took the sanitary napkin from her bag and, shaking, threaded the ends through the sanitary belt loops, replaced her underwear, and headed toward the door. She shook the whole way home, drawing stares from others on the bus, vaguely aware that they shied away from her as she shook. At home, she tried to cook dinner that night, but turned the task over to her oldest girl, Kathy, instead. She muttered something about not feeling well and with difficulty climbed the stairs to bed. By the time he came in that night, she had begun to retch. It was mostly dry heaves, as there had been nothing on her stomach for the week leading up to the appointment. Her nerves had been too tightly strung. But he left her alone for once. By morning, the bed was soaked with her sweat and blood, and her daughter's hand to her brow found she was burning up. Kathy went for Mrs. Pritz, and together they helped her down the stairs, where a policeman and an ambulance driver helped her away. At Philadelphia General, they admitted her to the women's sepsis wing. There, row upon row of women sweated and cried their last. The abortionist had punctured her uterine wall and intestines. The blood was a slow hemorrhage, not postpartum flow. Septicemia had spread through her bloodstream. Kathy sat holding her hand, wiping her brow, promising to care for the younger kids, swearing never to marry. Mrs. Pritz stopped by, then turned away, ashamed of any connection between her whispered gossip and the unstoppable inevitability of her neighbor's death. A nurse bent over the deathbed, trying to coax out a signed confession, trying to wrest the abortionist's name from her fevered brain. But she never knew it. Her 16 children, teens to infants, were abandoned to the unmitigated mercies of their drunken progenitor, Motherless.